Okay. We have an introduction to the history of psychology, chapter 11, American Psychology and Functionalism. In chapter 9, we considered the origins of academic psychology in Germany. And additionally, we saw that Titchener's brand of psychology in the United States, which was called structuralism, was essentially a psychology of pure consciousness, with little concern for practical application. In this chapter, we will look at the first psychology. Sorry, I've been sick, so I'm a little off today. In this chapter, we will look at what psychology was like in America before Titchener, and then at what psychology became when the doctrine of evolution combined with the U.S. zeitgeist to create the first uniquely American school, functionalism. Early U.S. psychology. It is often assumed that the U.S. psychology did not exist before Titchener and William James. In his presidential address to the Ninth International Congress of Psychology at Yale University in 1929, James McKean Cattell said that U.S. history of U.S. psychology before the 1800s would be as short as a book on snakes in Ireland since the time of St. Patrick, insofar as psychologists are concerned. America was then like heaven, for there was not a damn soul there. In making such statements, Cattell assumed that only experimental psychology was real psychology and that everything else was mental or moral philosophy. Titchener agreed and argued forcibly with this that experimental psychology should be completely separated from philosophy and especially from theology. The problem with Cattell and Titchener's argument is that it ignored the fact that experimental psychology grew out of non-experimental psychology, and therefore to understand the former, one must understand the latter. Let me grab a pen. Okay. In an attempt to set the record straight, J.W. Fay wrote American Psychology before William James. A.A. Roback wrote A History of American Psychology in 1952, which traces U.S. psychology back to the colonial days. Also, Joseph Brozek edited a book titled Explorations in the History of Psychology in the United States in 1984. For our purposes, however, we will follow Sahakian's 1975 description of the 4 stages of U.S. psychology, which begins circa 1640. There were, of course, Native Americans here well before that date, but we know very little about about ideas they held with respect to psychology. Stage 1, Moral and Mental Philosophy, 1640 to 1776. In the early period of moral and mental philosophy, to learn psychology was often to learn the accepted theology of the day. Like all other subjects taught at the time, psychology was combined with religious indoctrination. The earliest U.S. universities, such as Harvard, founded in 1636, were modeled after the British universities, where it was common practice to perpetrate religious beliefs. A period of American Enlightenment began in 1714 when John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1690 arrived in the colonies and had been a widespread influence. Samuel Johnson, 1696 to 1772, the first president of Columbia University, which was founded in 1754, embraced Locke enthusiastically. As you should recall, Locke considered a number of topics clearly psychological in nature. For example, child psychology, the nature of consciousness, the nature of knowledge and perception. Lockean philosophy provided the basis for a logic and a psychology that could be used to support one's religious belief. Roback says that for this period, psychology existed for the sake of logic, and logic for the sake of God. Stage 2, Intellectual philosophy. During which was 1776 to 1886. During the stage of intellectual philosophy, psychology became a separate discipline in the United States, largely under the influence of Scottish common sense philosophy. As we saw in Chapter 6, the Scottish school was a reaction against philosophers such as Hume, who maintained that nothing could be known with certainty and that moral and scientific laws were merely mental habits. Scottish philosophers such as Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, disagreed that sensory information should be accepted at face value, naive realism. The Scottish philosophers also maintained that self-examination yields valid information and that morality is based on self-evident intuitions. This common sense philosophy had clear implications for theology. The existence and nature of God need not be provided logically because one's personal feelings could be trusted on these matters. With the respectability of the senses and the feelings established, textbooks written by Scottish philosophers began to include such topics as perception, memory, association, attention, language, and thinking. Such a textbook was written by Dugald Stewart, 1753 to 1828, entitled Elements of Philosophy of the Human Mind in 1792, and was used at Yale University in 1824. Soon, U.S. textbooks bearing a close resemblance to those of Scottish philosophers began to appear, such as Noah Porter's The Human Intellect, with an introduction the Human Intellect with an Introduction upon Psychology and the Soul, 1868. Porter's text represented a transitional period when psychology was leaving the realm of philosophy and becoming a separate discipline. Porter's book defined psychology as the science of the human soul, and converted such topics as consciousness, sense perception, development of intellect, association of ideas, and memory and reason. Stage 3, the U.S. Renaissance, 1886 to 1896. As noted in the last chapter, Herbert Spencer's Principles of Psychology was used as a text at Harvard in the 1880s. And in 1886, John Dewey, which is going to be discussed later, published Psychology, which described the new empirical science. Also in 1887 came the American Journal of Psychology. Maybe we should know these things. I don't know. The first psychology journal in the United States. And in 1890, William James, The Principle of Psychology, was published. All of these events marked the beginning of psychology that was to emphasize the individual differences, adaptation to the environment, and practicality. In other words, a psychology that was compatible with evolution. Since the days of the pioneers, people in the United States emphasized individuality and practicality, and adaptation to the environment had to be a major concern. This explains why the United States was such fertile ground for physiognomy, phrenology, mesmerism, and spiritualism, practices that purported to help individuals live more effective lives. It was also during this stage that Titchener began his structuralist program at Cornell University in 1892, which successfully competed with functionalism for several years. So stage 4, U.S. functionalism, and 1896 and beyond. During the stage of U.S. functionalism, I'm going to struggle with that word, science, concern for practicality, emphasis on individual and evolutionary theory combined into the school of functionalism. Sahakian in 1975 marks the beginning of functionalism at 1896 with the publication of John Dewey, A Reflex Arc in Psychology. Titchener was at Cornell from 1892 to 1927, meaning that structuralism and functionalism overlapped. Members of the two schools were sometimes adversaries, and there was little constructive dialogue between them. The schools nicely illustrate Kuhn's concept of paradigm because their assumptions, goals, and methodologies were distinctly different. For the structuralist, the assumptions concerning the mind were derived from British and French empiricism. The goal was to understand the structure of the mind, and the primary research tool was introspection. For functionalists, the assumptions concerning the mind were derived from evolutionary theory. The goal was to understand how the mind and behavior work in aiding an organism's adjustment to the environment. And research tools included anything that was informative, be it introspection, the study of animal behavior, or the study of the mentally ill. In short, structuralism and functionalism were incommensurable. Themes of functionalism. Oh, sorry, that's a note. That's not the thing. Characteristics of functional psychology. Functionalism was never a well-defined school of thought, with one recognized leader or a singular methodology. Amid functionalism's diversity, however, common themes ran through the work. Keller, in 1973, explains, these are some bullet points I'll list here, the functionalists opposed what they considered the sterile search for the elements of consciousness in which the structuralist engaged. The functionalists wanted to understand the function of the mind rather than provide a static description of its contents. They believed that mental processes had a function to aid the organism in adapting to the environment. That is, they were interested in the is-for of the mind rather than the is, its function rather than its structure. The functionalists wanted psychology to be a practical science, not a pure science. They sought to apply their findings to improvement of personal life, education, industry, and so on. The functionalists urged the broadening of psychology to include research on animals, children, and abnormal humans. They also accepted the eclectic methodology, from mazes to mental tests. The functionalist interest in the why of mental processes and the behavior led directly to concern with motivation. Because an organism will act differently in the same environment as its needs change, these needs must be understood. Therefore, the organism's behavior can be understood. The functionalists accept both mental processes and behavior as legit subject matter for psychology, and most of them viewed introspection as one of many valid research tools. The functionalists tended to be more ideographic than nomothetic. Not really sure what that word means. Oh, that is that they were more interested in what made organisms different from one another. Okay, vocab, maybe. Personal vocab. What made organisms different from one another rather than what made them similar. All functionalists were directly or indirectly influenced by William James. Before we review the thoughts of some members of the school of functionalism, we too must consider the foundation provided by William James. William James, 1842 to 1910. Represents a transition between European psychology and U.S. psychology. That's a big title. His purpose was never to suggest a school of thought, but his ideas contained the seeds that would grow into the school of functionalism. As mentioned, James had already brought prominence to the U.S. psychology through the publication of Principles 2 years before Titchener arrived at Cornell. James was 25 years older than Titchener, and James died in 1910 when Titchener's influence was at its peak. James's psychology, however, became far more influential than Titchener's. In fact, soon after the publication of Principles, James began to compete with Wundt for the unofficial title of the worldwide voice of psychology. And in 1896, the Third International Congress of Psychology met in Munich. Wundt's laboratory was 17 years old, and he was 64. James's Principles was 6 years old, and he was 54. At the time, a Berlin newspaper referred to Wundt as the psychological pope of the old world, and to James as the psychological pope of the new world. although neither Wundt nor James attended the conference, and the designation of Pope indicated their status. William James was born in New York City. His brother Henry, who had become a famous novelist, was born 15 months later. Their father, Henry James Sr., who had lost a leg in an adolescent accident, embraced the mystical Christian theology of Emanuel Swedenborg in 1688 to 1772. So enchanted was elder James that he wrote a book titled The Secret of Swedenborg. Henry James Sr. was independently wealthy and believed his children should receive the best possible education. After several private schools and tutors in the United States, the father decided that a European education would be better. So William attended schools in Switzerland, France, Germany, and England. His early life was highly stimulating, involving a great deal of travel and exposure to intense intellectual discussions at home. And in 1860, at 18 years of age, after showing a talent for painting, William decided on a career as an artist. However, his father was so distressed by his career choice that he moved the family away from William's art teacher and even threatened suicide if William persisted on this course. Unfortunately for William, no career choice seemed to satisfy his father. Mr. James was not only a critical part of William's desire to paint, but when he followed his father's wishes and chose science, the elder James belittled the choice. Finally, when William embraced metaphysics, because his father praised philosophy as the most elevated intellectual pursuit, Henry maligned William for adopting the proper kind. And in 1861, James enrolled as a chemistry student at Harvard University. He soon switched to physiology to prepare himself for a career in medicine. And in 1864, at the age of 22, he enrolled at Harvard's medical school. James's medical studies were interrupted when he accepted an invitation from Louis Agassiz, 1807 to 1873, the famous Harvard biologist, to go on an expedition to Brazil. Seasick most of the time, James also came down with smallpox. Once he recovered, he decided to return to continue his medical studies, but after arriving back home, his health deteriorated, his eyesight became weak, and he experienced severe back pains. In 1867, James returned to Germany and bathed in mineral springs in hopes of improving his back problems. While in Germany, he began to read psychology and philosophy and attend lectures by Helmholtz and Raymond. In his diary, James shared a letter written to a friend in 1867, which showed that this was the time when James discovered Wundt and agreed with Wundt that it was time for psychology to become a science. Stand by for tea. James's crisis. James returned to the United States and finally obtained his medical degree from Harvard in 1869, at the age of 27. After graduation, however, James's health deteriorated further, and he became deeply depressed. Apparently, one reason for his depression was the implications of materialistic physiology and psychology that had so impressed him. It was clear that to James that if the materialism was correct, it applied to him as well. This meant that anything that happened to him was beyond his control. His depression, for example, was a matter of fate, and it made no sense to attempt to do anything about it. James's acceptance of Darwin's theory of evolution exacerbated the problem. In Darwin's view, there is variation, natural selection, and survival of the fittest. There is no freedom of choice. A major turning point in James' life came when he read an essay on free will by Charles Bernard Renouvier, something like that, 1815 to 1903. After reading this essay, James in 1920 wrote in his diary, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvelier's second Essayes. I'm sure that's like French for essay. And I see no reason why his definition of free will, the sustaining of thought because I choose, well, I guess this is his definition, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts." I guess, okay. Need to be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present until next year that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will. Hi there, too. When I felt like taking a free initiative, like daring to act originally without carefully waiting for contemplation of the external world to determine all for me, suicide seemed most manly form to put my daring into. Now I will go a step further with my will. Not only act with it, but believe as well. I believe in my individual reality and creative power. This change in beliefs improved James's depression, and he became highly productive. Here is where we also have the beginnings of James's pragmatism, the belief that if an idea works, it is valid. Thus, is the ultimate criterion for judging an idea should be the idea's usefulness or cash value. Okay, so the ultimate criterion for judging an idea should be the idea's usefulness. At this point, we also see the conflict James perceived between the objective scientific viewpoint based on determinism and personal subjective feelings, such as the feeling of one's will is free. James used pragmatism to solve the problem. While using the scientific method in psychology, he said it is necessary to assume that human behavior is determined. As useful as this assumption was, however, it had limits. Certain metaphysical questions lay beyond the reach of science, and the subjective approach was more useful in dealing with them. Okay, so therefore, according to James, both scientific and philosophical approach must be used in the study of human behavior and thought. To assume that all aspects of humans should be known through scientific research, he said, was akin to a physician giving all his patients ticks because it was the only thing that he could cure. If something about humans, for example, free will, could not be studied effectively using a certain method, James said, one did not throw out the aspect of human existence. Rather, one sought alternative methods of investigation. In other words, for James, it was not proper for science to determine which aspects of the human experience were worthy of investigation and which were not. James proposed a radical empiricism by which all consistently reported aspects of human experience are worthy of study. About James, Heidenbreder in 1933 said, "It was his opinion that nothing that presented itself as a possibility should be dismissed without a hearing." Following his own advice, as he often did, James explored the phenomenon of religious experience and summarized his findings, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, in 1902, a volume that remains a standard text in psychology of religion courses even today. And in 1872, James was given an opportunity to teach physiology at Harvard, which he did for 1 year, and then toured Europe for a year before returning to Harvard to teach, but this time his course concerned the relations between the physiology and psychology. And in 1875, James created a small demonstration laboratory, which he used in teaching his course. This has raised a controversy concerning who should be given credit for establishing psychology's first laboratory. Wundt in 1879 or James in 1875. Usually the credit is given to Wundt because his laboratory was more elaborate and designed for research instead of merely teaching demonstrations. James retired from Harvard in 1907 and died of a heart condition in his country home near Mount Kokorua, New Hampshire, and on August 26, 1910, resting peacefully in his wife's arms. The Principles of Psychology. In 1878, publisher Henry Holt offered James a contract to write a textbook on psychology. The textbook was finally published 12 years later, and in 1890, when James was 48 years old. Although James's Principles of Psychology was to revolutionize psychology, James, in 1920, did not think much of it. He indicated in a letter that he sent to his publisher along with the manuscript, "No one could be more disgusted than I at the sight of the book. No subject is worth being treated of in 1,000 pages. Had I 10 more years, I could rewrite it in 500, but as it stands, it is this or nothing, a loathsome, distended, tomb-filled, bloated, dropsical mass, testifying to nothing but two facts. First, that there is no such thing as science of psychology, and second, that W.J. is an incapable." James's highly influential Principles appeared in 2 volumes, 28 chapters, and a total of 1,393 pages. 2 years later, James published a condensed version of his Principles titled Psychology, a Briefer Course in 1892. The Briefer Course came to be called Jimmy, as the larger Principles was called James. In James's writings, we find treatment of a diverse array of topics, many of which later researchers pursued. As we will see, however, the themes of practicality, or pragmatism, the individual permanent, and individuality permeate most of his writings. Sorry, I can't talk today. Following his radical empiricism, James was always willing to entertain a wide variety of ideas, ranging from religion, mysticism, faith healing, and psychic phenomena to the most vigorous scientific facts and methods available in psychology at the time. The Spanish-born U.S. philosopher and poet James's Harvard colleague, George Santayana, in 1920, said of James, "I think it would have depressed him if he had to confess that any important question was finally settled. He would have still hoped that something might turn up on the other side, and that just as the scientific hangman was about to dispatch the poor convicted prisoner, an unexpected witness would ride up in hot haste and prove him innocent." Almost everything in Principles can be seen as a critical evaluation of what James perceived Wundt's approach to psychology to be. James was especially harsh in the following passage. "Within a few years, what one may call a microscopic psychology has arisen in Germany, carried on by experimental methods, asking, of course, every moment for introspective data, but eliminating their uncertainty by operating on large scale and taking statistical means. This method taxed patience to the utmost and hardly could have arisen in a country whose natives could be bored. Such Germans as Weber, Fechner, and Wundt obviously cannot, and their success has brought into the field an array of younger experimental psychologists bent on studying the elements of mental life, dissecting them from the gross results in which they are embedded, and as far as possible reducing them to quantitative scales. The simple and open method of attack having done what it can, the method of patience, starving out and harassing to death is tried. The mind must submit to the regular siege in which minute advantages gained night and day by the forces that hem her must sum themselves up at last into her overthrow. There is little left of a grand style about these new prism, pendulum, and chronograph philosophers. They mean business, not chivalry. What generous divination and that superiority in virtue, which was thought by Cicero to give a man the best insight into nature, have failed to do. Their spying and scraping, their deadly tenacity and almost diabolical cunning, will doubtless some day bring about. James, of course, was responding to Wundt, the experimentalist. If James has been able to probe deeper into Wundt's voluntarism and into his later Volcker psychology, he would have seen a remarkable similarity between himself and Wundt. In any case, it was Wundt, the experimentalist, who, after reading James's principle, commented, "It is literature, it is beautiful, but it is not psychology." Although James appreciated Fechner's excursions into the supernatural, James wrote a sympathetic introduction to the English translation of Fechner, the little book of Life After Death. He did not think much of Fechner's scientific endeavors, which had so impressed Wundt. In many ways, James was more closely aligned with the type of psychology seen in Strumpf. But within the principles, James tries to offer a fair consideration between the empirical and the rational, between the experimental and the phenomenological. This approach allowed critics anchored in those camps to find James inconsistent, but it also made the book an enduring classic. For more about James's ideas in the context of principles, see Blanchard and Schneider in 1942, and Donnelly in 1992, Johnson and Henley in 1990, and MacLeod in 1969. Steam of consciousness. With his concept of steam of consciousness, James opposed those who were busy searching for the elements of thought. In the first place, said James, consciousness is personal. It reflects the experience of an individual and therefore is foolhardy to search for elements common to all minds. Secondly, consciousness is continuous and cannot be divided up for analysis. Let anyone try to cut a thought across in the middle to get a look at its section. The rush of the thought is so headlong that it almost always brings us up at the conclusion before we can arrest it. Or if our purpose is nimble enough, we do arrest it. It ceases forthwith to be itself. As a snowflake crystal caught in a warm hand is no longer a crystal but a drop. So instead of catching the feeling of relation, moving to its term, we find that we have caught some substantiative thing. Usually the last word we were pronouncing, statistically taken, and with its function, tendency, and particular meaning in the sentence quite evaporated. The attempt at introspective analysis in these cases is in fact like seizing and spinning a top to catch its motion, or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. And third, consciousness is constantly changing. Even though consciousness is continuous and can be characterized by a steady stream from birth to death, it is also constantly changing. James quoted Heraclitus's aphorism about the impossibility of stepping into the same river twice. For James, the same is true. The same is true of the conscious experience. One can never have exactly the same idea twice, because the stream of consciousness that provides the context for the idea is ever changing. Fourth, consciousness is selective. Some of many events entering the consciousness are selected for further considerations, and others are inhibited. James in 1890 writes, "We see the mind as..." I get so thrown off when I'm trying to read this dude's writing. "We see that the mind is at every stage a theater and simultaneous possibilities. Consciousness consists of the comparison of these with each other, the selection of some and the suppression of the rest by the reinforcing and inhibiting agency of attention." And finally, and perhaps the most important, consciousness is functional. This idea permeates all of James's writings, and it is the point from which the school of functionalism developed. According to James, the most important thing about consciousness, and the thing that the elementists overlooked, is that purpose is to aid the individual in adapting to the environment. Here we see the powerful influence of Darwin on U.S. Scientific psychology. Consciousness, then, is a personal, continuous, constantly changing, selective, and purposeful. Very little in this is compatible with the view held by Wundt or the structuralists. James reached the following famous conclusion concerning consciousness. Consciousness, then, does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. Such words as chain or train do not describe it fitly as it presents itself in the first instance. It is nothing joined, it flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. Although James first mentioned stream of consciousness in his 1884 article on some omissions of introspective psychology, Holland in 1986 notes that George Henry Lewes used the term 4 years earlier in his Problems of Life and Mind in 1880. Habits and instincts. James in 1890 believed that much animal and human behavior is governed by instinct. Why do the various animals do what seem to us such strange things? In the presence of such outlandish stimuli, why does the hen, for example, submit herself to the tedium of incubating such fearfully uninterested set of objects as nesting of eggs, unless she is some sort of prolific inkling of the result? The only answer is ad hominem. We can only interpret the instincts of brutes by what we know of instincts in ourselves. Why do men always lie down when they can? Why do men always lie down when they can on soft beds rather than on hard floors? Why do they sit around the stove on a cold day? And why, in a room, do they place themselves 99 times out of 100 with their faces towards the middle rather than to the wall? Why do they prefer saddle or mutton and champagne to hardtack and ditch water? Why does the maiden interest the youth so that everything about her seems more important and significant than everything else in the world? Nothing more can be said that these are human ways, and that every creature likes its own ways, and takes to following them as a matter of course. James did not believe that instinctive behavior is blind and invariable. Rather, he believed that such behavior is modifiable by experience. Furthermore, he believed that new instinct-like patterns of behavior develop within a lifetime of an organism. James called these learned patterns of behavior habits. According to James, habits are formed as an activity is repeated. Repetition causes the same neural pathways to, from, and within the brain to become more entrenched, making it easier for energy to pass through those pathways. Had a neurophysiological explanation of habit formation. Sorry. Thus, James had a neurophysiological explanation of habit formation, and his account of learning was very close to Pavlov's. As we will see next chapter. Habits are functional because they simplify the movements required to achieve the result, increase the accuracy of behavior, reduce fatigue, and diminish the need to consciously attend to performed actions. For James, in 1890, then it is a habit that makes society possible. Habit. This is all written from him. Habit alone is what keeps us all within the bounds of ordinance, and saves the children of fortune from the envious uprising of the poor. It alone prevents the hardest and most repulsive walks of life from being deserted by those who brought up for those brought up to tend therein. It dooms us all to fight out the battle of life upon the lines of our nature or our early choice, and it makes the best of a pursuit that disagrees, because there is no other from which we are fitted. It is too late to begin again. It keeps different social strata from mixing. Already at the age of 25, you see the professional mannerism settling down on the young commercial traveler, on the young doctor, on the young minister, on the young counselor at law. You see the little lines of cleavage running through the character, the tricks of thought, the prejudices, the ways of the shop, in a word, from which the man can by and by no more escape. His coat sleeve can suddenly fall into a new set of folds. On the whole, it is best he should not escape. It is well for the world that in most of us, by the age of 30, the character has set like plaster and will never soften again. Through habit formation, we can make our nervous system our ally instead of our energy. For this, we must make automatic and habitual, as early as possible, as many useful actions as we can. And guard against the growing into ways that are likely to be disadvantageous to us, as we should guard against the plague. James in 1892 offered 5 maxims to follow in order to develop good habits and eliminate bad ones. 1. Place yourself in circumstances that encourage good habits and discourage bad ones. 2. Do not allow yourself to act contrary to a new habit that you are attempting to develop. Each lapse is like letting fall of a ball of string which one is carefully winding up. A single slip undoes more than a great many turns to wind again. Do not attempt to slowly develop a good habit or eliminate Do not attempt to slowly develop a good habit or eliminate a bad one. Engage in positive habits completely to begin with and abstain completely from bad ones. And 4. It is not the intention to engage in good habits and avoid the bad ones that is important. It is the actual doing so. There is no more contemptible type of human character than that of a nerveless sentimentalist and dreamer who spends his life in a weltering sea of sensibility and emotion, but who never does a manly, concrete deed. And 5. Force yourself to act in ways that are beneficial to you, even if doing so at first is distasteful and requires considerable effort. All of James's maxims converge on a fundamental principle. Act in ways that are compatible with the type of person that you would like to become. If only we all did that. The self, according to James. James, in 1892, discussed what he called the empirical self, or the me of personality, which consists of everything that a person could call his or her own. In the wildest possible sense, a man, me, empirical self, is the sum total of all that he can call his. Not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house and his wife and his children, his ancestors and friends, his reputations and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. James divided the empirical self into 3 components: the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. The material self consists of everything material that a person could own in his or her could call his or her own, such as his or her own body, family, and property. The social self is the self known by others. A man has many social selves, as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their mind. The spiritual self consists of person's states of consciousness. It is everything we think, and it includes emotions associated with our various states of consciousness. The spiritual self then has to be with the experience of one subjective reality. The empirical self, the me, is the person known by himself or herself, that there is also an aspect of self that does the knowing, the I. Thus for James, the self is partly known and partly knower, partly object and partly subject. James admitted that dealing with the me, which was much easier than dealing with the I, or that when he called the I, or what he called pure ego. James struggled with his concept of self as a knower, and admitted that it was similar to the old philosophical and theological notation such as soul, spirit, or transcendental ego. Self-esteem. James was among the first to examine the circumstances under which people feel good or bad about themselves. He concluded that a person's self-esteem is determined by the ratio of things attempted to determined by the ratio of things attempted to things achieved. Okay. With no attempt, there can be no failure. With no failure, no humiliation. So our self-feeling in the world depends entirely on what we back ourselves to be and do. It is determined by the ratio of our actualities to our supposed potentialities, a fraction of which our pretensions are the dominator, and thus numerator our success. Thus, self-esteem equals success over pretensions. It should be noted that according to James, one could increase self-esteem either by succeeding or by attempting less. To give up pretensions is as blessed at a relief as to get them gratified. Okay. And he said that in 1892. There is the strangest lightness about the heart when one's nothingness in particular line is once accepted in good faith. All is not bitterness in the lot, not the lover sent away by the final inexorable. No, many Bostonians, and inhabitants of other cities too, I fear, would be happier women and men today if they could once for all abandon the notion of keeping up a musical self, and without shame let people hear them call a symphony a nuisance. How pleasant is the day when we gave up striving to be young or slender. Thank God, we say, those illusions are gone. Everything added to the self is a burden as well as a pride. A certain man who lost every penny during the Civil War went and actually rolled in the dust, saying he had not felt so free and happy since he was born. Emotions. James reversed the traditional belief that emotion resulted from the perception of an event. For example, if traditionally believed that if we see a bear, we are frightened and we run. According to James, if we see a bear, we run and then we are frightened. Perception, according to James, causes bodily reactions that are experienced as emotions. In other words, the emotions we feel depend on what we do. James, in 1890, put his theory as follows. Our natural way of thinking about emotions is that the mental perception of some fact excites the mental affection called the emotion, and this latter state of mind gives rise to the bodily expression. My theory, on the contrary, is that bodily changes follow directly the perception of exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same change as they occur is the emotion. Common sense says, we lose our fortune, we are sorry and we weep. We meet at the bar, we are frightened and we meet a bear, we're frightened and we run. We are insulted by a rival, we are angry and strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, and that one mental state is not immediately induced by another, and that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful. As the case may be, without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, paleness, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. We might then see a bear and judge it best to run, receive an insult and deem it right to strike, but we should not actually feel afraid or angry. Coupled with James's belief in free will, his theory of emotion yields practical advice. Act the way you want to feel. If we believe James, there's a great deal of truth in Oscar Hammerstein's lines. Whenever I feel afraid, I whistle a happy tune, and the happiness in the tune convinces me that I am not afraid. Whistling to keep up courage is no mere figure of speech. On the other hand, sit all day in a mopping posture, sigh and reply to everything with a dismal voice, and your melancholy lingers. There is no more valuable precept in moral education than this. As all who have experienced know, if we wish to conquer undesirable emotional tendencies in ourselves, we must assiduously. Sorry, sometimes I can't read words when they're separated by a hyphen. And in the first instance, cold-bloodedly go through the outward movements and those contrary dispositions because we prefer to cultivate. The reward or persistency will infallibly come in the fading of the sullenness or depression and the advent of real cheerfulness and kindliness in their stead. James's theory of emotion provides still another example of the importance of the zeitgeist. The Danish physician Carl George Lang in 1834 published virtually the same theory about the same time. In recognition of the contributions of both men, the theory is now known as the James Lang theory of emotion. Most immediately after this theory is presented, it was harshly criticized by such individuals as Wilhelm Wundt and Walter Buchanan. For a review of these and other criticisms, see Finger in 1994. However, subsequent research has often favored James and Lang. Free will. Although James did not solve the matter of free will, he did arrive at a position in which he was comfortable. He noted that without the assumption of determinism, science would be impossible, and insofar as psychology was to be a science, it too must assume determinism. Science, however, was not everything, and for certain approaches to the study of humans, the assumption of free will might be fruitful. Science must constantly be reminded that her purposes are not the only purposes, and that the order of uniform causation, which she has use for, and is therefore right in postulating, may be enveloped in a wider order in which she has no claims at all. James's analysis of voluntary behavior. According to James' ideomotor theory of behavior, an idea of a certain action causes an action to occur. He believed that a vast majority of cases, ideas of action flowed immediately and automatically, habitually or reflexively into behavior. This automatic process continues unless mental effort is expended to purposefully select and hold an idea of interest in consciousness. So for James, voluntary action and mental effort were inseparable. The ideas of various behavioral possibilities are retained from previous experience, and their recollection is a prerequisite to voluntary behavior. The supply of various movements that are possible left in the memory by experiences of their involuntary performance, thus the prerequisite of voluntary life. From the ideas of various possible actions, one is selected for attention, and that is the one that causes behavior. And continues to do so as long as the idea is attended to. Therefore, what holds attention determines action. The will functions, then, by selecting one of the many ideas of action we are interested in doing. By fiat, the will extends energy to hold the idea of interest in consciousness, thus inhibiting other ideas. Effort of attention is thus the essential phenomenon of will. It is by controlling our ideas of behavior that we can control our actual behavior, because ideas cause behavior. It is important to attend to the ideas that result in behavior deemed desirable under the circumstances. The terminus of the psychological process in volition, at the point to which the will is directed and applied, is always an idea. So if we combine James's theories of volition and emotion, what we think determines what we do, and what we do determines how we feel. James believed that bodily events cause thoughts, and that thoughts cause behavior. Thus, on the mind-body question, he was an interactionist. Exactly how the mind and body interacted was not known to James, and to him the nature of the interaction may never be known. He said nature, in her unfathomable design, has mixed us of clay and flame, the brain and the mind, and the two things hang indubitably together and determine each other's being, but how or why no mortal may ever know. Pragmatism. Everywhere in James's writing, his belief in pragmatism. According to pragmatism, which is the cornerstone of functionalism, any belief, thought, or behavior must be judged by its consequences. Any belief that helps create a more effective and satisfying life is worth holding, whether such a belief is scientific or religious. Believing in free will was emotionally satisfying to James, so he believed in it. According to the pragmatic viewpoint, truth is not something out there in a static form of waiting to be discovered, as many of the rationalists maintained. Instead, truth is something that must be gauged by effectiveness under changing circumstances. What works is true, and because circumstances change, truth must be forever dynamic. There is a kinship between Weihinger's philosophy of as-if as we saw in Chapter 9, and James's pragmaticism. Both insisted that words and concepts be judged by their practical consequences. For both, arriving at concepts such as God, free will, and matter, reason, the absolute, and energy was not the end of the search for knowledge, but the beginning. The practical consequence of such concepts must be determined. If you follow the pragmatic method, you cannot look on any such word as closing your quest. You must bring out each word its practical cash value. Set it as work within the stream of your experience. It appears less as a solution than as a program for more work. James's pragmatic philosophy appears in the description of methods that psychology should employ. He urged we use both introspection and experimentation, as well as the study of animals, children, preliterate humans, and abnormal humans. In short, he encouraged the use of any method that would shed light on the complexities of human existence. He believed that nothing useful should be omitted. And in 1907, he published Pragmaticism, dedicated in the memory of John Stuart Mills, which he delineated two types of personality, the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded people are rationalistic, are principle-oriented, intellectual, idealistic, optimistic, religious, dogmatic, and they believe in free will. And conversely, the tough-minded people are empiricistic, fact-oriented, sensationalistic, materialistic, pessimistic, irreligious, skeptical, and fatalistic. James viewed pragmatism as a way of comprising between the two worldviews. The pragmaticist simply takes from each list whatever works best in the circumstances at hand. Again, the criterion of the validity of an idea, according to the pragmaticist, is usefulness. No idea, no method, no philosophy, no religion should be accepted or rejected except on the basis of usefulness. Rationalism sticks to logic and the empyrean or lofty and abstract. Empiricism sticks to the external senses. Pragmaticism is willing to take anything. To follow either logic or the senses and to count the humblest and most personal experiences. She will count mystical experiences if they have practical consequences. She will take a God who lives in the very dirt of private fact, if that should seem a likely place to find him. Her only test of probable truth is the works best in the way of leading us, what fits every part of life best and combines with the collectivity of experiences demands, nothing being omitted. If theological ideas should do this, if the notion of God in particular should prove to do it, how could pragmaticism possibly deny God's existence? She could see no meaning in treating as not true a notion that was pragmatically so successful. Following his belief that any idea has potential pragmatic value, James enthusiastically embraced parapsychology, and in 1884 was the founder of the American Society of Psychical Research. For an interesting survey on James' thoughts on parapsychology, religion, and faith healing, see Murphy and Ballo, 1960. James's contributions to psychology. James helps incorporate evolutionary theory into psychology by stressing what is useful. He represented a major departure from the pure psychology in both voluntarism and structuralism. For James, as well as for the functionalists who followed him, usefulness defined both truth and value. James expanded research techniques in psychology by not only accepting introspection, but also encouraging a technique that promised to yield useful information about people. by studying all aspects of human existence, including behavior, cognition, volition, and even religious experience. James also expanded the subject matter of psychology. As we will see in Chapter 20, James's eclecticism is very much in accordance with postmodernism. James's students at Harvard included many we will see in this chapter: Angel, Calkins, Hall, Centinela, Thorndike, and Woodworth. Others were author Gertrude Stein and co-founder of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, W.E.B. Du Bois. James's ideas are not only considered foundational for functional psychology and pragmatic philosophy, but can be seen in behaviorism, cognitive science, and existential phenomenological psychology, as well as clinical psychology. Numerous biographies exist, all of which highlight not only his intellect, his gift as a writer, but also his kindness and impish sense of humor. And in 1892, when James was 50, he decided to devote his attention to philosophical matters, something that necessitated relinquishing the directorship of Harvard's Psychology Laboratory. To maintain the laboratory's reputation as the best in the country, James sought an outstanding, creative, experimentally oriented psychologist, and certain one who did not just parrot Wundtian psychology, and at least as James understood it. He found such a person as Hugo Mustenberg. Hugo Mustenberg, born in East Prussian port city of Danzig, now Gdańsk, Poland, Hugo Mustenberg, 1863 to 1916, was one of 4 sons of prominent parents. His father was a successful businessman, his mother a recognized artist and musician. Both his mother and father died before he was 20 years old. Throughout his life, Mustenberg had a wide-ranging interest. In his early years, he displayed talent in art, literature, poetry, foreign languages, music, and acting. While studying at university at Leipzig, he heard a lecture by Wundt and became interested in psychology. Mustenberg eventually became Wundt's research assistant and received his doctorate under Wundt's supervision in 1885 at the age of 22. Perhaps on Wundt's advice, Mustenberg next studied medicine at the University of Heidelberg, and receiving his medical degree in 1887, that same year he began teaching at the University of Freiburg. He started a psychology laboratory and began publishing papers on time perception, attentional processes, learning, and memory. During the time when he was Wundt's assistant, one of Mustenberg's jobs was to study voluntary activities through introspection. The two men disagreed, however, over whether the will could be experienced as a conscious element of the mind during introspection. Wundt believed that it could, whereas Mustenberg believed that it could not. In fact, Mustenberg did not believe that will involved in voluntary behavior at all. For him, as we prepare to act one way or another, we consciously experience bodily preparedness and confuse it with the will to act. For Mustenberg, then, what we experience consciously as will is an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of bodily activity. This idea, of course, is diametrically opposed to Wundt's interpretation of voluntary behavior. For Wundt, volitional behavior is always preceded by the conscious will to act. Although James could never have removed consciousness as a causal element in his analysis of voluntary willful behavior, he did see in Mustenberg's position some support for his ideomotor theory of behavior. If nothing else, both analysts noted a close, direct relationship between thoughts and behaviors. However, the relationships postulated were converse. For James, ideas cause behavior. For Mustenberg, behavior causes ideas. In fact, there was a closer correspondence between James's theory of emotion and Munsterberg's analysis of voluntary behavior. As we have seen, the James Lange theory of emotion states that consciously experienced emotions are byproducts of bodily reactions elicited by situation. For Munsterberg, the feeling of willful action resulted from awareness to convert to behavior, or readiness to action overtly, elicited by a situation. In both cases, emotion for James, the feeling of volition for Munsterberg, consciousness experience is a byproduct or an epiphenomenon of behavior. In the case of volition, James's analysis was much closer to Wundt's than it was to Munsterberg's. In any case, in 1888, Munsterberg elaborated his theory in Voluntary Action, a book that James called a masterpiece, and Wundt criticized harshly. James was impressed by many of Munsterberg's publications and cited them often in his principles. He arranged to meet Munsterberg in Paris at the First International Congress of Psychology and in 1889, and their relationship strengthened further. After completing Principles, James wanted very much to leave psychology, especially experimental psychology, so that he could more actively pursue his interest in philosophy. To make the change, James needed someone to replace him as director of the Harvard Psychology Lab. And in 1892, the same year that Titchener arrived at Cornell, James offered Munsterberg the job despite the fact that Munsterberg could read but not speak English. Munsterberg accepted and learned to speak English so well and so quickly that his classes were soon attracting many students. Although he adjusted well, Munsterberg could not decide whether he wanted to give up his homeland, Germany, in favor of lifelong commitment in the United States. And in 1895, he asked for and received a leave of absence that he could return to the University of Freiburg. After 2 years, he was unable to obtain the type of academic appointment that he sought. He wrote to James in 1897, once again accepting the position at Harvard. However, Munsterberg never severed his emotional ties with his homeland. For several years, Munsterberg did extremely well at Harvard, and in 1898 he was elected president of the American Psychological Association and became chair of the Division of Philosophy at Harvard, which at the time still included psychology. When in 1900 he published Basics of Psychology, he dedicated it to James. As time went on, however, James's pragmatic attitude towards philosophy and psychology began to irritate Munsterberg, who had a more positivistic approach to science. He was especially appalled by James's acceptance of psychoanalysis and religious phenomena in the realm of psychology. For Munsterberg, mysticism and mediums were one thing, psychology was quite another. Experimental psychology and psychic hocus-pocus did not mix. More and more, however, Munsterberg's interests turned to the practical applications of psychological principles. Munsterberg felt very strongly that psychologists should attempt to uncover information that could be used in the real world. With his efforts, Munsterberg did much to create what is now referred to as applied psychology. Munsterberg's applied psychology. In an attempt to understand the causes of abnormal behavior, Munsterberg saw many mentally ill people. Because he was seeing them for scientific reasons, he never charged them a fee. He applied his treatment, which consisted mainly of causing his patients to expect to improve, to cases of alcoholism, drug addiction, phobia, and sexual dysfunction, but not psychosis. He felt that psychosis was caused by the deterioration of the nervous system and could not be treated. Along with the suggestion that individuals could improve as a result of his effort, Munsterberg also employed reciprocal antagonism, which involved strengthening the thoughts opposite to those causing problems. Although Munsterberg was aware of Freud's work, he chose to treat symptoms directly and did not search for the underlying causes of those symptoms. Munsterberg said Freud's theory of unconscious motivation, the story of the subconscious mind, can be told in 3 words: there is none. Forensic psychology. Munsterberg was the first to apply psychological principles to legal matters, thus creating forensic psychology. Among other things, he pointed out that the eyewitness testimony could be unreliable because sensory impressions could be illusory, suggestion and stress could affect perception, and memory was not always accurate. Munsterberg would often stage traumatic events in his classroom to show that even when witnesses were attempting to be accurate, there were wide differences in individual accounts of what had actually happened. Munsterberg urged that psychological methods replace the brutal interrogation of criminals. He believed that harsh interrogation could result in false confessions because some people want to please the interrogators. Some need to give in to authority figures, and some very distressed people may feel the need to be punished. Munsterberg published his thoughts on forensic psychology in his best-selling book, On the Witness Stand, in 1908. In this book, he described an apparatus that could detect lying by observing changes such as those in pulse rate and respiration. Others would follow Munsterberg's lead and later create the lie detector. Industrial psychology. Munsterberg's Vocation and Learning in 1912 and the Psychology of Industrial Efficacy in 1913. We usually consider the beginning of what later came to be called industrial psychology. In these books, Munsterberg dealt with such topics as methods of personnel selection, methods of increasing work efficacy, and marketing and advertising techniques. To aid in personal selection, for example, he recommended defining the skills necessary for performing a task and then determining the person's ability to perform that task. In this way, one could learn whether a person had the skills necessary for doing a certain job adequately. Munsterberg also found that whether a task is boring could not be determined by observing the work of others. Often, work that some people consider boring is interesting to those doing it. It is necessary, then, to take individual differences into account when selecting personnel and when making job assignments. Munsterberg's fate. Because his work in applied psychology, Munsterberg was well known to the public, the academic world, and the scientific community, serving in 1898 as the 7th president of the APA. William James made psychology popular within the academic world, but Munsterberg helped make it popular with the general public, showing its practical uses. In addition, Munsterberg had among his personal friends some of the most influential people in the world, including President Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, the Nobel Prize-winning philosopher Bertrand Russell. He was invited to dine at the White House and his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He and his wife were often hosted European scholars and German royalty. In addition, he was awarded several medals by the German government. By the time Munsterberg died in 1916, however, the general attitude towards him had turned negative. His death went essentially unnoticed. The main reason for his unpopularity was his desire to create a favorable relationship between the United States and his native Germany. Never obtaining U.S. citizenship, Munsterberg maintained a nationalistic loyalty towards Germany. He believed that both Germans and Americans had inaccurate stereotypes of each other. He wrote books attempting to correct them. For example, The Americans in 1904. In another book, American Problems in 1910, Munsterberg was highly critical of Americans, saying that they had a general inability to concentrate their attention on any one thing for very long. He explained that national inability to attend to the fact that in the United States women were influential in forming intellectual and cultural development. The Intellectual vulnerability of women also explained the popularity of psychological fads such as seances. While James was attempting to discover if any of the claims of mediums were valid, Munsterberg was busy exposing them as dangerous frauds. As World War I approached, Munsterberg found himself caught up in the U.S. outrage over German military aggression. He was suspected of being a spy. Many of his colleagues at Harvard disassociated themselves from him, and there were threats against his life. Perhaps because all of the stress, Munsterberg died December 16th, 1916, from a cerebral hemorrhage just as he began a lecture. He was only 53 years old. For an interesting account of Munsterberg's rise to fame and his decline into disfavor, see Spillman and Spillman. Harvard sought Titchener as a replacement for Munsterberg, but Titchener refused the offer. James McKean Cattell applied for the position, but his application was denied. The position was finally filled by William McDougall, whom we mentioned in the last chapter and we will cover in the next. Mary Whiton Calkins. When Munsterberg took over James's psychology lab, he also became supervisor of the psychology graduate students. And it was he who directed their dissertation research. One of those graduate students was Mary Whiton Calkins, 1863 to 1930. Calkins was the oldest of 5 children. She grew up in Buffalo, New York, where her father, Wolcott Calkins, was a Protestant minister. And in 1881, the family moved to Newton, Massachusetts, where the Reverends accepted a pastorate. After completing high school in Newton, Calkins attended Smith College and graduated in 1885. Shortly after graduation, Calkins accompanied her family on a year-long vacation in Europe. Upon their return, Calkins was offered a position at Wellesley College teaching Greek. This began Calkins' more than 40-year affiliation with Wellesley. After Calkins had taught for about a year at Wellesley, college officials sought a woman to teach experimental psychology. Because no woman was available for the job, Wellesley officials decided to arrange for a training of one. Calkins was designed as that person because of her success as a teacher and her interest in philosophy. Where are we? Oh, there we go. The appointment was made with the understanding that Calkins would study experimental psychology for a year. This posed a problem because none of the nearby institutions accepted female graduate students at the time. And in 1890, Calkins contacted Josiah Royce and William James at Harvard, seeking permission to attend their seminars. Royce served as APA president in 1901, but was primarily a philosopher. Both Royce and James said yes, but Charles W. Eliot, Harvard's president, said no. After intense lobbying by Royce, James, and Calkins' father, Eliot reversed his position and allowed Calkins to attend graduate seminars. He stipulated, however, that she attend without being officially enrolled as a Harvard student. Eliot was concerned that Calkins' official enrollment would open the door to coeducation at Harvard, which he was strongly opposed. When it became known that Calkins would be attending James's seminar, the male students promptly withdrew, presumably in protest. This left Calkins alone in the seminar with James to discuss his just published principles. Calkins, in 1930, described her experience. I began the serious study of psychology with William James. Most unhappily for them, and most fortunately for me, the other members of the seminary in psychology dropped away in the early weeks of fall in 1890, and James and I were left on either side of the laboratory fire. The Principles of Psychology was warm from the press, and my absorbed study of those brilliant, erudite, and provocative volumes was interpreted by their writer, was my introduction to psychology. While Calkins was attending seminars at Harvard, she was also doing laboratory work at Clark University under the supervision of Edmund C. Stanford, who previously noted as Terman's advisor. This, too, was a special arrangement. Her research on dreams under Stanford's supervision was presented at the first annual APA meeting in December 1892 and published in 1893. Calkins also published a paper on the association of ideas, stimulated by James's seminar in 1892. In the fall of 1891, Calkins returned to Wellesley, where she established a psychology laboratory and introduced experimental psychology into the curriculum. After about a year, Calkins felt the need to continue her formal education, so she returned to Harvard again as a non-registered student. By now, James had moved on to philosophy on a full-time basis, and Munsterberg had taken over the psychology laboratory. For the first year and a half while working with Munsterberg, Calkins continued to teach at Wellesley. Then in the academic year of 1894 to 1895, she took an academic leave to devote herself full-time to laboratory work with Munsterberg. Calkins, who was 2 months older than Munsterberg, got along very well with him. In fact, that Calkins was fluent in German probably helped. Munsterberg remained Calkins' mentor and advocate for many years. Strangely, Calkins and Munsterberg shared the same view of professional women. Both believed that the primary female roles were mother and wife. Calkins pitied and condemned women who declined to marry to pursue a career. Although Calkins never married, she also disavowed feminism, believing that it was incompatible with family values, wherein feminism makes encroachments into the institutions of family and cannot follow it. Munsterberg agreed, except for the cases of a few exceptional women who should pursue careers instead of motherhood. Clearly, Calkins was seen as such an exception. While working in Munsterberg's laboratory, Calkins did original research on the factors influencing memory. And during this research, Calkins invented the still widely used paired associate technique to study the influence of frequency, recency, and vividness of memory. For example, Calkins showed her subjects a series of colors paired with numbers. Later, after several paired presentations, the colors alone were presented, and the subjects were asked to recall the corresponding numbers. Among other things, Calkins found that frequency of occurrence facilitated memory more than recency or vividness did. In addition to her work on paired associate learning, Calkins did pioneering research on short-term memory. So impressed was Munsterberg that he described Calkins as the most qualified student he had supervised at Harvard. And he urged Harvard officials to accept her as a doctoral candidate. His request was considered and rejected, and in April 1895, Calkins' request was given an unofficial PhD examination, which she passed with high honors. James, who was a member of her examining committee, described her performance as the best he had ever seen at Harvard. In James's opinions, Calkins' performance exceeded even that of George Centennial, who then had the reputation of having had the most outstanding performance on a Harvard PhD examination. Still, Harvard refused to grant Calkins a doctorate because she was a woman. And in 1894, Harvard created Radcliffe College as a degree-granting women's college. Radcliffe offered no graduate courses or seminars. It had no laboratories. Those students officially enrolled at Radcliffe actually did all their graduate work and research at Harvard. And in April 1902, the governing board of Radcliffe voted to grant Calkins a PhD even though she had never been enrolled there. Munsterberg encouraged her to accept, but she refused. After her unofficial PhD examination at Harvard, Calkins returns to Wellesley in the fall of 1897 as an associate professor, and in 1898 she was promoted to full professor. Although trained in mainstream experimental psychology at Harvard, and Clark and Calkins soon came to dislike the cold, impersonal nature of such psychology. Her attention shifted to self-psychology, showing the influence of James. According to Heidbreder in 1972, Calkins came to see the classical experimental psychologists as out of touch with important portions of the subject matter of psychology as it presents itself in ordinary experience as she herself observed it, and as she believed, by checking with others that they too observed it. Calkins lamented that psychology, in its efforts to rid itself of metaphysical speculation, has essentially dismissed the concept of the self as unnecessary. Modern psychology has quite correctly rid itself of metaphysician's self. The self, often inferred to be free, responsible, and immortal, and thereupon natively supposed that it has thus cut itself off from the self, and the self of psychology has no one of these inferred characters. It is the self immediately experienced, directly realized, in recognition, in sympathy, in vanity, in assertiveness, and indeed in all experiencing. Furumoto in 1991 speculates that it was Calkins' life circumstances that created her intense interest in self-psychology. It should come to no great surprise that the alternative to the classical experimental view espoused by Calkins concerned itself with something of the utmost significance to her and to the other women with whom she shared her Wellesley world, namely the reality and importance of selves in the everyday experience. Wentworth in 1909 argued that Calkins' interest in self-psychology reflected her deep religious convictions. Her personal and intellectual lives seem to have been bonded together by what I have come to think of as distinctly moral paste, composed of an interest not in the study of selves in isolation, but in the study of selves living in knowledge of their interconnectedness to other human beings, to a divine being, or to both. Calkins continued to promote the self-psychology in the heyday of behaviorism, when the topic of self-psychology was essentially taboo. Her tenacity finally resulted in the creation of a U.S. brand of personality theory featuring the concept of the self. According to Woodward in 1984, there were two pioneers of personality theory in the United States, Calkins and Gordon Allport, and Calkins was first. Calkins remained at Wellesley until her retirement in 1929. During her academic career, she published 4 books and over 100 journal articles. Also, it was Calkins, again demonstrating her facility with foreign languages, who translated La Métaire's La Home Machine, A Man, a Machine, into English. Her major contribution to psychology was her version of self-psychology, which she developed over a period of 30 years. So significant were her contributions, even without an advanced degree, she was elected the first female president of the APA in 1905. She was also the first female president of the American Philosophical Association in 1918. She was granted honorary degree by Columbia in 1909 by her alma mater, Smith, in 1910. And in 1929, she was given honorary membership in the British Psychology Association. Calkins died in 1930 at the age of 65. For more interesting biographical information, see Furumoto 1991 and Scarborough and Furumoto in 1987. Granville Stanley. In his influence on U.S. psychology, Granville Stanley, 1844 to 1924, was second only to William James. As we will see, Hall was a theorist. Above all, he was an organizer. The number of firsts associated with Hall are unequaled by any other U.S. psychologist. Hall was born on the 1st of February in a small farming town in Asheville, Massachusetts, and in 1863 he enrolled in Williams College, where he learned associationism, Scottish common sense philosophy, and evolutionary theory, as he prepared for the ministry. Upon graduation in 1867, he enrolled in the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. There, Hall gave indications that perhaps he was not cut for the clergy. During his year in New York, he explored the city with zest, roaming the streets, visiting police courts, attending churches of all denominations. And he joined a discussion club interested in the study of positivism, visited the theater for plays and musicals, tutored young ladies from elite New York, visited a phrenologist, and generally had an exciting year. He was not noted for his religious orthodoxy. After preaching his trial sermon before the faculty and students, he went to the office of the president for criticism. Instead of discussing his sermon, the president knelt and prayed that Hall would be shown the errors of his ways. And in 1868, a small grant made it possible for Hall to travel to Germany, where he studied theology and philosophy. He also spent much time in beer gardens and theaters and engaged in considerable romance. And in 1871, Hall accepted the position at Antioch College in Ohio, where he not only taught English literature, French, German, and philosophy, but also served as a librarian, led the choir, and did a little preaching. While in Antioch, Hall read Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology, and in 1876 he was offered an instructorship of English at Harvard. During his stay at Harvard, Hall became friends with William James, who was only 2 years his elder. Hall did research in Harvard's medical school, writing up his results as The Muscular Perception of Space, which he offered as his doctoral thesis in 1876. This was the first psychological dissertation in America. After receiving his doctorate, Hall returned to Germany, where he studied with Wundt, Dubois-Reymond, and Helmholtz. Hall was Wundt's first student from the United States. In a letter to James, Hall confessed that he had learned more from Helmholtz than from Wundt. And in 1880, at the age of 36, Hall returned to the United States after giving a series of lectures. He accepted a position at Johns Hopkins University in 1883. Hall set up a working psychology laboratory. It is generally agreed that Wundt founded the world's first psychology laboratory in Leipzig in 1879, and that Hall's laboratory at Johns Hopkins was the first psychology lab in the United States. As previously mentioned, the laboratory James established was in 1875, is generally discounted because it was designed to teach demonstrations rather than for research. While at Johns Hopkins, besides founding a psychology laboratory, Hall founded the first U.S. journal dedicated to psychological issues, the American Journal of Psychology, which initially appeared in 1887. Also, while at Johns Hopkins, Hall taught James McKean Cattell and John Dewey, who were later to become key figures in functionalism, and Arnold Gesell, who became a highly influential pediatrician. Polish-born Joseph Jastrow, 1863 to 1944, had worked on psychological topics with the famous philosopher C.S. Peirce before he was dismissed from Hopkins. Following Peirce's departure, Jastrow completed his dissertation under Paul, perhaps best known for the widely used duck-rabbit image that illustrates the Gestalt principles of figure and ground. He was founder of the psychology program at the University of Wisconsin and the APA president in 1900. Also among Hall's students at Hopkins was Thomas Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, who went on to become the 28th President of the United States. Under Hall's influence, Wilson actually pondered giving up on his study of politics and history and majoring in psychology instead. President of Clark University. In 1888, Hall left Johns Hopkins to become the first president of Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he remained a professor of psychology. At Clark, Hall maintained a strong hand in directing and shaping U.S. psychology. Hall was a great graduate teacher for American psychology, and by 1893, 11 of the 14 Ph.D. degrees from the American universities had been given by him. And by 1898, this had increased to 30 awarded out of 54. While at Clark University, Hall invited 26 of the most prominent psychologists in the United States and Canada to meet in Worcester to form an association of psychologists. This meeting took place July 8, 1892, and represents the founding of the APA. Some of those who were invited did not attend, such as William James and John Dewey, but they were considered charter members because they were invited to join and they supported the association. The group also decided to extend membership to new organization of 5 others, including 2 that Hall had neglected to invite, and 3 recent Leipzig PhDs, including Munsterberg and Titchener. This brought the charter membership in the APA up to 31. Hall was elected the first president of the APA. And in subsequent years, William James and John Dewey would also serve as presidents. Besides being the first president, Hall was one of only 2 individuals to be elected to the presidency twice. James was the other. However, Hall died in 1924 before he could serve his second elected term. From an original membership of 31, the APA now has more than 154,000 members and affiliates. And in 1891, Hall founded the second U.S. psychological journal, Pedagogical Seminary. I'm not sure what that word is. Now the Journal of Genetic Psychology. And in 1904, he founded the Journal of Religious Psychology. And in 1917, the Journal of Applied Psychology. Hall maintained an interest in religion. And in 1917, published Jesus Christ in the Light of Psychology, which describes Jesus as a mythical creation who symbolizes all of the best human tendencies. For Hall, the implications of the Jesus myth for humane living were more important than the theological implications. The story of his death and resurrection, embodiment, the fundamental rhythm of his psychic life. From pain to joy, the experience and understand his rhythm in conversion was the supreme lesson of life. The message Jesus was not to be projected upon the clouds or to be made into a cult for assuring immortality, but was to be realized within each individual in this world, in service of his fellow man. One critic of the book said, if it is probable that President Hall had not carefully enough studied the Gospels, it is quite certain that he has not reverently enough studied the person of Jesus Christ. In general, Hall's book was not received well by many organized religion. I would read it. Developmental psychology. Hall had many interests, even the histories of philosophy and psychology, to which he made significant contributions. Still, his legacy then and now was primarily 2 areas: psychology of religion and developmental psychology across the lifespan. Hall was enamored with evolutionary theory. He said in his autobiography, "As soon as I first heard it in my mouth, I think I must have been almost hypnotized by the word evolution, which was music to my ears and seemed to fit in my mouth better than any other." So strongly did Hall feel about evolutionary theory that he believed that it, instead of physics, should act upon a model for science. He believed that evolution explained not only the phylogenetic development of the human species, but also the development of each individual. That is, he believed that each individual in his or her lifetime reenacted all evolutionary stages of the human species. This idea, most associated with Ernst Haeckel in 1834 to 1919, is called recapitulation theory of development. Every child, from the moment of conception to maturity, re-encapsulates very rapidly at first, and then more slowly, every stage of development through which the human race, from its lowest beginnings, has passed. Haeckel, the premier proponent of evolution in Germany, was part of the zeitgeist Hall had encountered during his studies there. During prenatal development, the single-celled organism develops into newborn child whose capabilities are equal to the number of mammals, lower than humans on the phylogenetic scale. In childhood, there is still evidence of impulsiveness, cruelty, and immorality that characterizes earlier, less civilized stages of human development. Hall's view was that these primitive impulses were not given expression in childhood, and they would be carried into adulthood. Hall therefore encouraged parents and teachers to create situations in which the primitive impulses could be given expression. Hall's magnum opus. In 1904, he was 60, and after 10 years of work, Hall published a 2-volume, over 1,300-page book titled Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education, which focused a wide variety of topics including growth norms, language development, diseases of childhood hygiene, juvenile crime, lying, showing off, bashfulness, fear, curiosity, and friendship. For Hall, adolescence occurred between the ages of 14 and 24, and masturbation during that period was discussed in considerable detail. Hall rejected the claim that masturbation caused psychosis or even death, but he did believe that it had a number of less severe consequences. Neural asthenia, optical cramps, weak sluggishness and heart action, purple and dry skin, anemic complexion, dry cough, and many digestive perversions can be attributed to the scourge of the human race. In addition, growth, essentially in the moral and intellectual regions, is dwarfed or stunned. However, of all the effects of masturbation, Hall believed that the most serious to be on the biological quality of the offender's offspring, revealing his acceptance of the Lamarckian theory. He said, "Worse and earlier than any of these psychic effects are those that appear in the offspring. Its effects are manifest nearer, perhaps, in the incomplete maturity of the mind and the body in the next generation, in persistent infantilism and over-ripeness of children. Masturbation," he said, "was destructive of that perhaps most important thing in the world, the potency of good heredity." To discourage this evil habit, Hall gave the following advice. Work reduces temptation, and so does early rising. Good music is moral tonic. Cold is one of the best of all checks. Cold washing without wiping has special advantages. Pockets should be placed well on the sides and not too deep, while habitually keeping hands in pockets should be discouraged. Rooms should not be kept too warm, beds should be rather hard, and coverings should be light. Hall focused exclusively on masturbation among boys. Evidently, masturbation among girls was something Hall either did not believe occurred or shied away from as too sensitive and potentially inflammatory to mention. That was Hall's magnum opus. Hall's opposition to coeducation. Hall opposed coeducation. Okay. And one of his main arguments for sex-segregated schools was that it enhanced sexual sublimation and thus facilitated social progress. Sex-segregated schools would hold the sexes apart, not only or simply to allow them to prosper along their natural different gender trajectories, but also as poles on battery separated to avoid the inevitable short circuit, and also because the hot, passionate, tingling, erotic sensibilities of adolescence, heightened by separation, created an intense field of force, a kind of adolescent social electricity that was Hall's designated path to progress. Hall believed that any sexual act not designed to produce offspring was sinful, but the temptation to engage in a sinful sex was great and not, if not overwhelming. Hall's proposed solution to the problem was the inhibition of adolescent sex drive. Such inhibition, he claimed, converts sexual desire into social progress. Powerful feelings, checked and redirected, erotic energy converted to mental energy. Hall's prescription for adolescence. His recipe for social progress and explanation for his own success. Although Hall didn't use the term sublimation in 1904, he certainly employed the concept. He did so a year before it appeared in Freud's published works. The later publications, Hall did not use the term sublimation after he became aware of Freud's definition and use of the term. Hall viewed females as vital for future evolution of the human species. And adolescence should be a period when females are trained for motherhood. As females are preparing for motherhood, males still have the need to satisfy primitive impulses, and therefore it makes no sense to include both sexes together in the same educational system. The premise of Hall's argument against coeducation was derived from three concerns of recapitulation. A, that adolescence was a critical period in the development of reproductive organs in women, and B, that the adolescent male needed freedom to engage in cathartic expression of his savage impulses, and C, the natural sex differentiation during adolescence was the basis for lateral attraction between the sexes. As part of his concern for the normal development of the female reproductive capacity, Hall in 1906 was worried about the associations with males might due to the normalization of the menstrual period. At the time when her whole future depends on normalizing the lunar month, is there not something not only unnatural, unhygienic, but a little monstrous in daily school associations with boys, where she must suppress and conceal her instincts and feelings at those times when her own promptings suggest withdrawal and stepping a little aside to let the Lord Nature do its magnificent work of efflorescence. In the address before the American Academy of Medicine in 1906, Hall elaborated his opposition to coeducation. coeducation, violates a custom of so universal that it seems to express the fundamental human instinct. Girls are attracted to the common knowledge which all share, to the conventional, to the more influenced by fashions and more imitative, and lack the boy's intense desire to know, be, and do something distinctive that develops and emphasizes his individuality. To be thrown on their own personal resources in sports, in a classroom, in nature study, in elementary laboratory, brings out the best in a boy, but either confuses or strains a girl. Hall's view on women, although widely accepted at the time, did not go unchallenged. For example, Martha Carey Thomas, a feminist, was the president of Bryn Mawr College, said, I had never chanced again upon a book that seemed to degrade me in my womanhood as the 7th and 17th chapters on women and women's education of President G. Stanley Hall's Adolescence. Dahl in 1986 indicates that Hall's views on women were paradoxical, as were Titchener's and Munsterberg's. On one hand, Hall was unambiguous against coeducation, and he believed that the primary role for women was motherhood. On the other hand, the beginning of the 20th century, Clark University, under Hall's leadership, is considered one of the institutions most open to female graduate students. In addition, Hall seemed to have been slightly supportive of female graduate students in psychology, as well as in many other fields. In general, Hall urged the study of adolescence because he believed that at this stage of development, habits learned during childhood were discarded, but new adults' habits had not yet been learned. I lost my spot. During this transitional period, the individuals were forced to rely on instincts, and therefore adolescence is a very good time to study human instinctual makeup. Hall's Adolescence went through several printings for 20 years after the initial publication. It remained the standard text in the field until it was displaced by Letta Setter-Hollingworth's text, The Psychology of the Adolescents, in 1928. Thorndike's assessment of Hall's classic view was that it was chock full of errors, masturbation, and Jesus. He is a madman. What do contemporary psychologists think of Hall's Adolescence? Arnett's overall evaluation is positive. Many of the findings we view today as new discoveries were already discussed by Hall 100 years ago. I cannot discuss all of them here, but I will focus on some of the similarities between So I will focus on some of the similarities I believe the most notable areas of similarity are the prevalence of depressed mood in adolescence, adolescence at a time when crime rates peak, adolescence at the time of high sensation seeking, susceptibility to media influences in adolescence, characteristics of peer relations in adolescence, and biological development during puberty. Part 2 coming up.